welcome to this week's material. Congratulations, guys, on getting to week 15. This is a wonderful accomplishment. You guys should give yourself a round of applause. Anatomy is not an easy course. It's very tough to understand. There's a lot of different things that really do not make sense at first, but once you get exposed to the material, things start to make sense. And I hope you guys are getting to that point now where certain things kind of make sense since you've been accustomed to this material for so long. But in saying that, we're going to move on to this week's material. So you guys are almost done. This is the last leg of the race. I know you guys will do well. Just finish strong. In saying that, let's move on to this week's material, the larynx and the neck. And I want to look at the larynx model so we can understand a little bit about what we're going to be speaking about today, just so it can make sense. So, let's start here. So, right, remember we went from nasopharynx to oropharynx to laryngopharynx. So, naso, oro to laryngopharynx. And now we're looking at the region of, or the point of the laryngopharynx. So now we're looking more inferior. Um, if I remove half of the laryngopharynx here, we can see the structure. The first structure for our list, the epiglottis. So this is the epiglottis here, and the epiglottis is a flap of cartilage at the root of the tongue. And during swallowing, the epiglottis is going to decompress to cover the opening of the windpipe or the larynx, right? So the larynx is the windpipe. Right, so this flap is going to come down and close to cover this opening, right? This is your windpipe, the opening. And then food is going to go from the laryngopharynx and go all the way into the esophagus. So let me show you guys the esophagus there, just so it can make a little bit of sense. Right, so remember I showed you that food is going to go, right, so this flap, this epiglottis is going to decompress, and then food is going to go from the laryngopharynx all the way into the esophagus. Right, and then into your digestive tract, and we went through that whole structure and system in the beginning of the course, but now you can see how food goes from the oropharynx to the laryngopharynx and then into the esophagus. Right, so this flap is going to decompress and close to cover the larynx, and then food is going to move in this region, and then it's going to go through the esophagus. Now that we have that, let's move on to some of the muscles of the larynx and some of the structures. So the first obvious structure is the thyroid gland, right? This is a gland, not a muscle. It has two lobes, left and a right lobe, and it's connected in the middle. We don't even know the structure, but just know that this entire structure here, the entirety of it is the thyroid gland. And connected to, let me just remove this actually. So, right, it has this connection point in the middle to connect the right and the left halves of the thyroid. Okay, so that was our thyroid gland. Now we're going to move into the structures of the larynx. Solidify that. Solidify that. Okay. I'm just going to do it like this just so we can see the structure bilaterally. So let me zoom in a little bit just so we can get a better view. Okay, okay. Now that we have a good view of the larynx, remember I removed half of the laryngopharynx before, so we can see the entry point that food is going to travel into from the laryngopharynx all the way into the esophagus when the epiglottis is closed, so food doesn't enter the windpipe. Now we're going to be looking at the anterior surface of the larynx, and then we have a few structures that we need to know before we move on. So the first structure, of course, the hyoid, the floating bone that we went over last week. Now we're going to be looking at a couple of different cartilaginous structures. We have the thyroid cartilage, we have the cricoid cartilage, and one thing about the cricoid cartilage is that it's not only in this it's not only seen in this anterior perspective. If you move posterior, right, it wraps around this whole region. So this whole region is the cricoid cartilage as well. So this is cricoid, this is cricoid, this is cricoid, this is cricoid, right? This is cricoid cartilage, that's cricoid cartilage, this is cricoid cartilage. So I just want to show you that it wraps around in a circle, right? So this whole region here is the cricoid cartilage. It wraps around in a circle. So now that we have that, now we can kind of examine a little bit. So thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage, you can see its borders there. And now I'm going to show you some of the muscles that are directly attached to the larynx. So two muscles that we need to know. The Before I even go into the muscles, I wanted to preface that today, when we're looking at these muscles, they are named for their inferior superior attachment. So from the inferior to superior attachment, that's going to be the name of that muscle. Usually it goes from origin to insertion, so the inferior aspect today is going to be most likely its origin, and its superior attachment is going to be where it's inserting on. So cricoid cartilage, right, and the thyroid cartilage, we have this muscle going from the cricoid cartilage to the thyroid cartilage. So this muscle must be cricothyroid. So cricoid cartilage to the thyroid cartilage, this muscle, cricothyroid. And then we have the same thing happening here with the thyroid cartilage and the hyoid bone. This muscle must be thyrohyoid, right? So thyroid cartilage to hyoid bone, thyrohyoid. So cricothyroid, thyrohyoid, right? From thyroid cartilage to hyoid bone, right? Remember, inferior to superior attachment, inferior to superior attachment. Now that we have that down, we can move on into some of the other structures in the larynx. Let me go back a little bit. Okay, so this is the place that I wanted to show. All right, we saw our epiglottis before. That's the flap that's coming down to cover the larynx. Now I'm going to. Okay, so one structure that we didn't go over was the arytenoid cartilage. So this is a cricoid, remember? And then above that, we see the arytenoid cartilages. The arytenoid cartilage on the left and right side. So this region, you see this empty region of space? This region is called the rima glottis. And the turning or the rotation of these arytenoid cartilages, of the arytenoid cartilage on the left and right side, is going to control the opening and closing of the rima glottis. So if I were to turn these, Right, so this is the rema glottis, this opening, right, this clear region of space. Right, just this border, rema glottis, and then the regions here and here would be the vocal folds. So let me get a better picture of that. Right, now we can see it perfectly. I was looking for this image earlier, but I guess I just found it. Right, so this is the rema glottis here, and then these are the vocal folds on the left and the right side. So vocal fold, and this region right in the middle of the vocal folds is the rema glottis. Right, so arytenoid cartilage. All right. So remember, the arytenoid cartilage on the left and the right side control the opening of the rema glottis, and the vocal folds are the borders of the rema glottis on the left and the right side, as we saw previously. Okay, now that we have that, we're gonna move into some of the structures on the neck. So remember, we were just looking at this muscle here, cricothyroid, and then we're looking at another muscle, the thyrohyoid. Right, that's this muscle here and this muscle here. That was thyroid, and that's cricothyroid. Now we're going to be looking at some of the other muscles of the neck. The first muscle being, let me get a more complete image because I want you guys to see the attachment points. So, okay, so we're just looking at the. I know it seems like a lot is going on, but we are just looking at the cricothyroid and the thyroid. Now we're going to be looking at some other accessory structures. The first being sternocleidomastoid. Right, so sternocleidomastoid. Sternocleidomastoid. This muscle is attaching from the sternum and the clavicle all the way to the mastoid process on the epicranial perspective. All right, so sternum, clavicle, all the way to the mastoid process, and this muscle is attaching to the mastoid process on the ectocranial perspective. I'm pretty sure I said ecto. So ectocranial perspective, right? That's the inferior view of the cranium, and the sternocleidomastoid is attaching to the mastoid process. So if I remove it, if I remove the spinous capitis here, this is the mastoid process. Right here. Right, and that was the attachment point for the muscle we were just seeing. Alright, so let me go back just so we can get a more complete image. So if I remove sternocleidomastoid, the mastoid process is right there. Boom, because we don't have to worry about that at all. Okay. muscles. So we just went over sternocleidomastoid, this muscle here, sternum to clavicle, sternum and clavicle to the mastoid process. Now we're going to be looking at the next muscle, the anterior scalene. So it seems a little bit complicated, but the way I remember the scalenes is that there are certain structures that come out in between the anterior and the middle scalene, and that's the brachial plexus. So the entire brachial plexus comes out between the anterior and the middle scalene. Alright, so this is the anterior scalene, this is the middle scalene, and this is the posterior scalene. So if let me just select those, anterior, middle, and posterior. Alright, so we see anterior, you see middle, and then you see posterior. Right, so, and then we see a bunch of different structures of the brachial plexus that are coming out in between the anterior and the middle scalene. So this is anterior, this is the middle scalene, right? And coming out in between them are the structures of the brachial plexus. Alright, so now we have that down. Another way to remember that you're looking at the anterior scalene muscle is that the phrenic nerve runs directly along the surface of anterior scalene. So phrenic nerve, anterior scalene. Right, you can see the phrenic nerve descending into the thoracic cavity to innervate the diaphragm. So anterior scalene is right here, and running directly on top of the anterior scalene is the phrenic nerve. Right, so anterior scalene, right, and then if I look at the brachial plexus in the middle of anterior scalene, you can see middle scalene. Right, so the brachial plexus in the middle of anterior and middle scalene, and then we have posterior scalene right there. Let me just clean this up a little bit. Alright, so you can kind of see how coming from in between anterior and middle scalene, see the brachial plexus. Alright, and then the phrenic nerve running directly on top of the anterior scalene muscle. Alright, and one other nerve I want to go over, since we are kind of covering most of the nerves now, is the hypoglossal nerve. So cranial nerve 12, hypoglossal. If I remove this parotid fascia here, let me make sure that we can see the carotid. So now that we have that, I'm going to remove all of the nerves and just put the hypoglossal nerve so we can see clearly. Hypoglossal. Okay. Okay, that is fine. Okay. So that's the only thing that we really need to be able to see is this descending branch here. So the hypoglossal nerve, looking at the external carotid artery, which is right here. So remember, we go from common carotid, and then common carotid turns into external and internal. Now we also have the carotid sinus in between there as well. So we have common carotid artery, we have the carotid sinus, and then we go into internal, which is right here. And we go into, I'm trying to be able to, I'm just going to go back to the, okay. So we go into internal and external. It's gonna inspect. Okay, there we go. Okay, so common carotid, common carotid. Then we go to internal, which is right there, and then we go to external. So external is going to the face, and internal is going to the brain to form the circle of Willis to contribute to the circle of Willis. And then we have our carotid sinus here. So in saying that, right along the external carotid artery, we can see the hypoglossal nerve. So let me remove that. So we can see the hypoglossal nerve right along the external carotid artery. Hypoglossal nerve. Okay, now that we're here, let's move on to some of the other muscle, starting with mylohyoid. So last week we went over mylohyoid. Right, it's attaching from the mandible all the way to the hyoid bone here. So this is the hyoid bone. That floating bone in the neck, hyoid. And the mylohyoid has a muscle superficial to it called the anterior digastric. So this is the anterior digastric muscle. And then we can also see coming from the anterior digastric, you can see a fibrous sling of digastric right here, and then the posterior digastric is coming directly from there. So posterior digastric. Alright, so posterior digastric is attaching to the mastoid process. So let me just remove sternocleidomastoid so we can see that. Sternocleidomastoid is already removed. Let me just remove spinous capitis muscle here. Okay, so we can see posterior digastric attaching directly to the mastoid process, which is right here. Then there's a muscle that's superficial to posterior digastric called stylohyoid. Stylohyoid. So there's a lot of different names this week, so be very careful. The names of the muscles are very, very similar. So a muscle that is superficial to the anterior digastric and the posterior digastric mostly is the stylohyoid. So let me just remove the parotid gland so we can see. Okay, so this is stylohyoid. Right, it's attaching from here. You can see this is the styloid process, and then you can see its attachment to the hyoid bone. So stylohyoid, styloid process to the hyoid bone. So styloid process to the hyoid bone, and we have stylohyoid. And then don't get that confused with the posterior digastric, which is slightly deep to this muscle, stylohyoid, which attaches to the mastoid process. Alright, and then we gastric, and mylohyoid here on the left and the right side. All right. So before we go into some of the muscles in the neck here, I forgot to mention one other muscle before, one other nerve before, which was the vagus nerve. I'm just gonna isolate it out just so we can see. Okay, so okay. So the muscle that I didn't speak about was the phrenic. Well, sorry, the vagus nerve. So let me move this down a little bit. Okay. So I said previously that on the anterior surface of this muscle, anterior scalene, right, running along anterior scalene is the phrenic nerve. But running literally directly next to common carotid is the vagus nerve. So let me just select all of those muscles so we can see that clearly. All right, you can see that a little bit better now that right on anterior scalene, we can see phrenic, and right next to common carotid is vagus. All right, now that we have that down, let's move on to the muscles and the neck here. Okay. All right. So the first muscle that I'm going to speak about is sternohyoid. Right. So remember, the muscles are being named from their inferior to superior attachment. Sternohyoid. Okay. So I'm looking at the sternum. Right. So this is the sternum. There's a muscle that's attaching to the sternum. Right. So we have these two muscles here, but it's this one. This is sternohyoid, right? So because it's going all the way from the sternum, and then it's going all the way to the hyoid bone. So sternohyoid, and you can see how the sternohyoid is attaching from the sternum all the way to the hyoid bone. So sternohyoid, inferior to superior attachment. So if I remove sternohyoid on one side, then the next muscle we have is sternothyroid. So sternum here, where this muscle attaches to the sternum, and then it goes all the way sternothyroid. It goes all the way to the thyroid cartilage. So sternothyroid, sternothyroid attaches from the sternum to the thyroid cartilage. I'm not sure if I said hyoid previously. It's thyroid. Sternothyroid, right? So inferior to superior attachment, sternothyroid. And then we have another muscle, the omohyoid. So omo is just a prefix that denotes scapula. So this muscle is attaching from the scapula, well, originating from the scapula, and attaching to the hyoid. So omohyoid, omohyoid, omohyoid. Alright, so just a little bit of a recap, just so we can go over these muscles again, just to make sure that it makes sense. Right. Last week we learned the platysma. Let's remove that. Okay. All right. So just going to go over them one more time, just so we can make sure we understand. Right. So inferior to superior attachment, we have sternocleidomastoid. Right, we can see it going from the sternum, clavicle, right, all the way to the mastoid process, right, all the way to the mastoid process. We have anterior, middle, and posterior scalene. Anterior scalene, middle scalene, posterior scalene. And remember, the brachial plexus is going to be in between the anterior and the middle scalene, and the phrenic nerve is going to run directly on top of the anterior scalene. Now that we have that, let's move on to some other muscles here. Right, we have sternohyoid, right, going from the sternum all the way to the hyoid bone. So sternohyoid. This is the hyoid bone. This is the sternum. Sternohyoid. Remove that. Now we have sternothyroid. It goes all the way from the sternum to the thyroid cartilage. So sternum to the thyroid cartilage, sternothyroid. And then omohyoid from the scapula all the way to the hyoid, omohyoid. And then we have a couple of muscles on the actual larynx itself, right, going from the cricoid cartilage to the thyroid cartilage, cricothyroid, right, on both sides, cricothyroid. Cricothyroid. And then we have this other muscle going from the thyroid cartilage to the hyoid. So thyrohyoid. Right, so from thyroid cartilage to the hyoid, thyrohyoid. And then we have mylohyoid again, going from the hyoid, the mandible, going from the mandible to the hyoid, mylohyoid. And then we have anterior digastric, posterior digastric. Right, posterior digastric attaches to, you can see this, attaches to the mastoid process. And then we have stylohyoid, and you can see it originating from the styloid process here, and then going all the way to the hyoid bone. All right, and I'm pretty sure that's everything. The last thing I'm going to go over is the difference between the venous and the arterial system that we need to know in the neck. Pretty simple. Let me just get it done real quick. Okay, here we go. Right, so in the neck, we were just previously speaking about the common carotid, which goes and turns into external and internal, and we have the carotid sinus right here. Right, external face, internal brain, and then we have the carotid sinus. But next to it, we have the internal jugular vein. this structure here. Right, and it's right next to the common carotid artery, internal jugular vein. Right, and that's mostly it. The last thing I'll do, I'll show you guys a couple of different cadaver images just so we can see how some of these images look in the actual human body. Right, so before, remember, we're looking at that muscle that went from the scapula all the way to the hyoid bone. It's omohyoid. And some of these muscles over here wouldn't make sense for me to really show you them because you can't see their inferior to superior attachment. But the most superficial one, sternohyoid, and then deep to sternohyoid is sternothyroid. Right, we see the internal jugular vein here, and next to it we can see the common carotid artery, and then the external carotid artery, and then internal carotid artery, and you can kind of see the carotid sinus right here. Up here you can see the hypoglossal nerve, and you can also see posterior digastric, and then you can see stylohyoid here. It's a slight bit of it right there. Posterior digastric, you can see anterior digastric, and the mandible. And then running directly on top of anterior scalene, you can see the phrenic nerve right here. Right, anterior scalene running directly on top of anterior scalene is the phrenic nerve. And in between the anterior and the middle scalene, we can see the brachial plexus. And then in this image, you can't quite see posterior scalene, but it should be deep somewhere here. But don't worry about that. And then sternocleidomastoid has been cut. It should traverse in this region. Right, and we cannot quite see the vagus nerve, so don't worry about that in this image. Let me see if I can find one more image that is decent. Here we go. Okay, so I think this is actually a good image for some of the structures. Okay, so we have our thyroid gland here. You can see the hyoid bone, the thyroid cartilage, and then cricoid cartilage here, going from the cricoid cartilage to the thyroid cartilage, cricothyroid, going from the thyroid cartilage to the hyoid bone, thyrohyoid. And a couple of different muscles that have been cut. Common carotid artery going into the external and internal. A little bit of the carotid sinus right there. You can see the internal jugular vein, which is directly next to common carotid artery. You can see the phrenic nerve traveling directly on top of anterior scalene. Middle scalene, you can't really see posterior scalene that well. And the brachial plexus, you can see it in between anterior and middle scalene. Brachial plexus. You can see anterior digastric up here, mylohyoid directly under it, and then you can see stylohyoid here, and then you can see in the back there posterior, but don't worry about that. Right, posterior digastric isn't really well seen, but right here is where it would be. And here's a good image of the vagus nerve. You can see the common carotid, and right next to the common carotid, you can see the vagus nerve traveling next to it here. And I don't think there's any other images that would be helpful. Well, I'll do this one because it has some of the good images of these nerves. So the first nerve that I want to show you guys is this one here, vagus. Right, so you can see vagus here. You can't really see, but you can't see the carotid. You can't see common carotid, but you can see vagus more towards the medial side, more towards the midline of the body. You can see anterior scalene. You can see middle scalene there. Right, and I wouldn't worry about anything else in this image. It'd be too hard for you guys to see some of the muscles on the anterior of the larynx. So forget about this image. I thought it would be a little bit better, but don't worry about it. That's really it. I hope this was helpful. Good luck on your lab exam and your lecture exam. I hope this video helped. I hope you're able to see some of the correlations and the relations with different structures and muscles. And good luck, guys. Have a great rest of your week.